This is a true story that is widely known in my village. People in the village still refer to this story as a haunting horror experience to this day. A long time ago, a wealthy family in my village reconstructed a dowry house. When it was completed, the owner of the house lavished the villagers with a big party. The party went on until the middle of the night. Everyone drank a lot until they blushed as they walked out. Following the departure of the guests, the residents of the house began to clean and rest in the new home. But in the middle of the night, while lying on the newly constructed bed, the owner felt extremely uneasy. He kept tossing and turning all night, unable to sleep, and then experienced severe stomach pain, cold and shivering all over his body. When he couldn't take it any longer, he turned to call his wife, who was lying next to him, to check on him. But he called again and again. His wife did not answer, so he went off to bed alone and checked the house's fireplace. As soon as he set his foot on the brick floor, his entire body became cold with such an unpleasant chill. He took a few steps, felt uneasy and looked back with trepidation. When he looked at the bed, he found himself lying motionlessly there. His entire face was white, his eyes wide open as if he was a corpse. He was terrified by the scene. He mumbled a few sentences, pointed to his own body, shivered, then held. He took a step back, seeing himself lying on the bed, but appearing to be placed on a coffin. He fainted out of fear, and gloomy darkness enveloped the space in front of his eyes. The wife awoke the next morning to prepare breakfast as usual. She waited for so long, but her husband never came out for breakfast. She entered the room to check. However, when she arrived, her husband's body was cold, but his pulse was still present, albeit weakly. She and her children rushed her husband to the hospital for an examination. However, no doctor was able to diagnose his illness. Her family agreed to let him stay in the hospital for an extended period of time, but there was no progress, so they returned him home in pain. At the hospital, his grandson stood behind his mother, concernedly looking at him. The house's owner at this time was in a coma, looking exactly like he had died. The whole face had begun to turn grey because of lack of breath. His son took his wife and children home to seek for treatment after completing the procedure at the hospital. Everyone in the house had been worriedly waiting beside his bed all night. Because the grandson needed to go to the toilet late at night, he took a flashlight and went out to the toilet alone. But as soon as he got to the door, a strange noise came from behind the child, like a large animal breathing. He turned his head towards the noise and noticed a figure twice the size of an adult slowly walking into the courtyard. That piqued the boy's interest, and he crouched silently behind him, watching this colossal monstrosity himself. The monstrosity rushed in front of the boy, dragging an iron chain on the ground, resounding throughout the yard. The boy assumed that was a thief in his house, so he recklessly approached and asked loudly who he was. But he didn't seem to hear his voice, and he went straight to the owner's room window. The boy went to the door, shouted loudly, and called his parents for help because he was afraid the giant would harm his grandfather. But as he moved forward, the giant's face appeared, clearly in the light, revealing the form of a long-tongued demon. His cheekbones protruded, and he slowly turned his face to look at him, showing his long tongue, which was long enough to touch the ground and threaten the poor boy. The scene caused him to panic and scream. His parents became terrified too when they heard his screams outside. The two dashed out to find him and discovered him sitting on the ground in front of the door to the grandpa's room. When his parents saw this, they immediately came over and helped him up. The two immediately inquired as to what had just happened. The boy cried out and pointed forward, claiming to have encountered a demon. Then he described the entire appearance of the demon he had encountered. At first, his parents didn't believe him. However, because of his tenacity, the two hesitated. His mother appeared to have recognized the problem and immediately advised her husband to invite a good shaman in the village to come over. The house's owner's son invited a shaman that night. This was my village's most well-known one. As soon as he walked into the house, he went to the owner's bed and took his pulse to check on his situation. After checking his pulse, he sighed and stated that the house's owner had a strange disease that he had never seen before. When her daughter-in-law heard it, she burst into tears, worrying that he would never wake up again. The shaman couldn't ignore after seeing it, but he needed more time to figure out what was causing it. He stood up and walked around, his hands clasped behind his back. A pensive and tense expression appeared on his face. Suddenly he turned to look at the man's bed, and his face changed color, revealing surprise. He was serious when he asked the daughter-in-law to find him a tape measure. He took it and carefully measured around the owner's bed. Nobody knew what he aimed for. He was measuring and calculating solemnly by pressing his knuckles. Then his face revealed a mixture of surprise and concern. He looked up at the daughter-in-law who was standing in front of him and asked her who built and designed this bed. The daughter-in-law attempted to recall and confirm with the shaman that this bed was designed by a builder. Later, the daughter-in-law added that her father and the builder had a falling out while the house was being constructed. Her father assaulted the builder, injuring him, and deducted a week's wages from him. The shaman immediately recognized the root of the problem after hearing the story. He was enraged, yelling at the builder for being a jerk. He pointed to the bed and told everyone in the house to dismantle it as soon as possible because it was actually a coffin. Everyone in the family initially didn't believe it, but when they double-checked it, everyone was shocked and had to admit it. The shaman then explained that in order to exact revenge on the owner, the builder purposefully fashioned his bed in the shape of a coffin and imprisoned the owner's soul within it. The homeowner's son and a few neighbors used a hammer to break the bed, as instructed by the shaman. Every brick had been broken and was scattered everywhere, with dust flying. After a while, the cement and sand bricks that served as the bed's background appeared, along with a paper doll in the center. The landlord's son and the shaman picked up the doll, and the owner's full name was written on the back. The shaman then prepared a cup of tonic for the host, which he carefully served to him. After half an hour of taking the medicine, the host moved slowly opening his eyes, as if he had just awoken. He opened his eyes and looked up at everyone in the house, his face worried and scared, as if he had just woken up from a nightmare. Despite the treatment, the owner's spirit was not much better as a result of a neurological complication, becoming a famous story in the village, and the builder also met with disaster later. My elementary school teacher was a person who didn't believe in ghosts, but that year, something terrible happened that made him start to change his mind. The school I attended at the time was small in the village. In the past, the school was even more rickety and shabby, but then with donations from everyone, it was also more spacious. My teacher's name was Zhang. He was always busy and dedicated to his work. That day, he stayed at the office very late to prepare the outline for the following day. As soon as it was all over, he was able to relax his body and stretch his shoulders. Then suddenly he heard a noise coming from the window. It was like someone was walking back and forth in the schoolyard and throwing sand into the room. He listened to hear better, then noticed that the noise was getting louder and louder. The more he heard it, the more it sounded like someone was moving the sand outside. Thinking that there were still some boarding students playing outside at this hour, he slowly approached the door to have a look. Strangely, when he opened the door, there was no one outside. Everything was still extremely quiet. Muttering a few words, he went back inside. He thought partly because he heard it wrong or just normal wind. So he quickly sat down at the table to prepare to continue working. But as soon as he sat down on the chair, the same noise started again. This time the sound was louder than before. At this point, he thought that someone was trying to make fun of him, so he went quickly and opened the door with a few scolding sentences. But it was still like at first. Everything was extremely silent outside, not even wind. Even that day the weather was hotter than usual. This thing made him start to wonder and be confused. He closed the door to go inside, but thought about the sound in his mind. But being a person who did not believe in ghosts, he still did not think much. Then he continued to sit at the table and drafted the outline for the rest. The noise was again heard outside the courtyard, this time more clearly and longer than the previous two, but he chose not to care about it anymore. Whatever it was, just didn't care. So he sat at the table and finished all his work without going out to the yard to check it out. After the work was done, it was already past midnight. There would always be boarding rooms for teachers to stay at the school. Since it was late at night and he still had to get up early tomorrow, he decided to stay in the teacher's boarding room. He also forgot that the strange noise from outside was no longer heard. He thought that someone must have known he was late and wanted to scare him, but they stopped when they got bored. At this moment, cold air rushed in from the door, surprising him, so he quickly looked out. The window was still closed, but there was a figure outside the door. Because it was too dark, the face could not be seen clearly. It seemed to be a man. That man was standing close to the window and staring at Mr. Zhang. Too surprised because suddenly at this time a stranger was standing outside the door looking at him, Mr. Zhang immediately ran to the door, thinking that the man had been teasing him by pretending to be a ghost, so Mr. Zhang was very angry. However, when he opened the door and looked at the window, the man had disappeared from time to time. Seeing that, Zhang was also confused as to what was going on. He shouted to ask if anyone was here teasing him, but everything remained silent. At this moment, he was also a little worried and felt strange. Maybe it was a ghost. Otherwise, how could it disappear so quickly? Besides, the school had never had strangers enter. But feeling that nothing happened, he quickly changed his clothes and went to bed because the following day was an important class. As soon as he lay down on the bed, Mr. Zhang began to hear the sound of sand pulling, footsteps and noise in the yard. It was louder and more chaotic than he first heard. Curious, he began to put his glasses on and listen carefully again, just afraid that he heard the wrong steps. And when he came up, there was no one like before. But the footsteps became louder and clearer. Certainly not by mistake. Mr. Zhang slowly got out of bed and put on his slippers. This time, he would be gentle, so that if someone teases, they would not be able to run in time. But when he looked out at the yard through the glass window, the things outside made him terrified. Many people were walking outside, or rather the whole yard was full of people. Suddenly, in the middle of the yard, he didn't know the graves. How could it be grown so quickly? Countless graves appeared all over the schoolyard. Fearing that he might have misjudged his vision due to fatigue or because he was in a dream, he carefully took off his glasses and wiped them carefully to see again. This time, it was unmistakable. No one made fun of him at all. He must have met a ghost. The schoolyard was now littered with graves and monstrous people. Their gazes were contorted and their white eyes had no irises. Some people even looked like they had sores, which were very scary. Suddenly, one of them discovered Mr. Zhang peeking from inside the room. That freaked him out. Mr. Zhang tried to cover his mouth and nose with both hands. He was afraid that even breathing lightly would be discovered by all those ghostly people. But it was too late. As soon as he covered his mouth, they also discovered him. So they turned all their attention to him. These people were so monstrous, even their heads were bent backwards as if broken. Their heads were hanging and looked terrible. After that, they gathered together and approached Mr. Zhang's room. More and more people flocked to the door of the room. They stood outside the glass door and looked inside. Only now could their faces be seen clearly. Some people had their entire faces destroyed. People had broken limbs. People had broken necks. People had blood all over their faces. The scene couldn't be more terrifying. Mr. Zhang was so scared that he fell backward. His legs were frozen, unable to move. They jostled and jostled each other, then pressed their faces to the glass as if they were watching something interesting, thinking they could rush into the room at any moment. Terrified, Mr. Zhang could only try and let out a scream when he passed out. What happened after that? Mr. Zhang didn't know anything anymore. The following morning, the other teachers came and found that Mr. Zhang had fainted on the ground, so they took him to the infirmary. He was finally able to wake up and still be at peace. After he calmed down, he also recounted everything that happened last night. After hearing the story, everyone suddenly remembered that this school was built on the land of a mass grave. There used to be a lot of strange things happening here. After that incident, the school invited a Feng Shui master to review the school, and the Feng Shui master proposed to build a large stone board in the middle of the schoolyard as a cover. And it worked. After building that stele, everything continued to go on as usual. No one was scared anymore. My village is a small piece of land with a few dozen houses, located next to a large dense forest, and a very few people come here. No one in my village knows when this forest existed, and no one dares to set foot in it. Since long time, no wild animals have appeared in this forest, only towering old trees standing side by side. However, the reason this forest has become such a dangerous obsession in my village is that no one has ever set foot in it that ever came back. Considering the story of a cousin in my family, despite the fact that he was lost in the forest and that many people in the village were looking for him, it has been a few years and there have been negative results. One day my best friend invited me to his house to watch a movie while his parents were away. We sat on the couch in the living room all night, watching horror movies. The spooky scenes created a tense atmosphere. I used to be a coward, so whenever a horror scene appeared on TV, I would jump and scream in terror. My friend Quing, seeing that I was a coward, made fun of me right away, eager to have an excuse to stay up all night tonight. I was mocked, which made me angry. I held at my two friends, attempting to demonstrate that I was not as shy as they claim. But Quing didn't think that was enough, so he took out a mid-denomination bill and placed it on the table in front of us, calling it a bet. The game would be a bet to see who dared to take a walk around my village's famous forbidden forest. Because of the aggressiveness, my other friend and I both agreed to bet. Everyone put money on the table, and whoever would win could keep all the money. We were confidently walking to the front of the jungle, unaware of the horror that was waiting for us inside. Quing was the game's instigator, so he volunteered to take the lead inside. I stood outside staring at his arrogant demeanor, but on the inside, I was feeling extremely uneasy. My friend and I stood huddled together to keep warm, watching Quing rushed inside and vanished in front of us. But it wasn't long before a young man figure emerged from the forest, hurrying from the inside out, looking desperate. I asked my other friend, who was skeptical, if it was our friend Quing. We were certain it was Quing until the figure in the forest became clearer, but seeing his attitude at the time piqued our interest even more. Quing ran until he couldn't breathe, as if he was being pursued by something terrifying behind him, his face still displaying his extreme fear. Quing appeared to fall to the ground at the edge of the forest. We had to hold him with our hands before he could stand, but he mumbled something very frightening. We kept asking Quing what happened in that forest, but it took him a long time to regain his composure and told us about what happened inside the forest. He claimed that there was a terrifying monster inside, and that as soon as he saw it, it rushed to him until out there. But when I looked back, there was no one behind Quing, which led me to believe that he made up stories to deceive us in order to win all the bets, so we didn't believe it. It took the initiatives to venture deep into the forest, proving Quing's claim that he was more cowardly than me. But this time Quing repeatedly stopped me, not only refusing to let me in, but also agreed to give me all the bets if I went out. I began to feel a little uneasy in my heart at this point, but the entire forest seemed to have some kind of magic that kept urging me to go deeper inside. I took my time walking inside, carefully inspecting my surroundings. I picked up a broken wooden stick lying on the ground as a defense for myself. I took a deep breath and started to walk along the path in front of me. Despite the fact that the two sides of the forest always gave off dark and cold winds, I became intrigued by the scene inside this mysterious forest, but the deeper I went, the quieter the forest became, making me shiver. I was about to turn around at the end when I was drawn in by the rustling sound next to me. I immediately turned my head to look, and there was a strange but very large man walking towards me. This man's face and figure became more visible in the darkness right in front of me. I took a step back to protect myself, holding the wooden stick firmly in my hand just in case of the worst scenario. I kept asking who the man in front of me was, but the other person flatly refused to answer. When the mysterious person was only a few inches away, I was shocked to realize it was my family's long-lost relative. This man did not respond to my question. Instead, he showed a devilish face with 2 lines of bright red blood running down the corners of his mouth. I didn't have time to process what was going on, but the current horror moment gave me a definite answer that I had encountered a monster, just as Quing had said earlier. This strange monster had a human-like body, but was much larger, and its legs resembled those of a wolf, complete with terrifying black sharp claws. His body was also covered in hair, and his skin sagged, as if only the outer skin covered the bones within. It reached out its hands and approached me where I was standing as if to grab me, leaving me terrified and speechless. I could only raise the wooden stick as a weapon for self-defense. I turned my head and ran away, screaming loudly as I ran, waiting for the monster to let down its guard. But the monster in the back would not let me leave. It kept chasing me to the outside while staggered with its head as if it wanted to separate from its body. I wasn't sure what mystical power this monster had that allowed it to run so fast, but I could hear his footsteps getting closer and closer to where I was standing. He abruptly reached out and grabbed my shoulder. I could feel the cold from my body mixed with the smell of decomposing flesh, making me nauseous and scared, as if I wanted to die again and again. Because there was no other option, I turned around, used all my strength, grabbed the wooden stick and smacked the monster's head hard. My unexpected blow rendered the monster defenseless, causing it to stagger for a few seconds before immobilizing. I took advantage of the brief moment of the opportunity, sprinting towards the forest's edge in an attempt to flee. But the further I ran, the more I felt like I was lost in a maze, as this monster appeared everywhere around me. They stood everywhere, behind the towering trees, lustfully looking at me. I tried to run, and after a few steps I arrived at a safe location where I met two friends who were waiting for me. In fear, I rushed to my two friends to look for help. I told my friends that I was being pursued by monsters in the deep forest. When they saw my panicked appearance, they grabbed a nearby tree and looked into the depths of the forest. But when I and the others returned, the entire forest was empty, and I had no idea when those monsters vanished. We decided to call the cops because we were so terrified. A few minutes later, the police arrived and accompanied us to the forest to search. The cops went deep inside and discovered the wooden stick I was holding earlier, embedded in a tree right where I fought off the monster. But after searching for a long time and failing to find any more clues, we were reprimanded by the cop. He considered that we were hallucinating because we had consumed too much alcohol. Only later, I realized that this scary forest was set up to lure curious, oblivious people like me inside as prey for a scary monster. That year, around the summer of 2009, the story happened to Yang's family. He was about 8 years old at the time, and on the occasion of the holiday, Yang's family decided to return to their hometown for a few days. It was Yang's first trip out of town, and he was very excited because it was in the countryside, far from the city, and convenient for visiting his grandparents' graves. Walked a little further from the bus station through some houses to reach the grandparents' house because no one had lived there in a long time. The Yang family had to clean up as soon as they arrived. After a long day of work, it was already dark when the three of them sat around the dining table. However, Yan acted strangely during the meal. He was looking out the door and smiling while eating, which drew Yang's mother's attention. She also looked out the door, but there was no one in the yard. But Yang kept looking at the door, then talked as if he was joking with his friends. He turned his face outside and howled loudly that they should wait until he finished eating before going outside to play, which made Yang's mother felt even stranger. Yang quickly let go of his chopsticks when he'd just eaten a little bit, wanted to go out and play with his friends. Yang's mother didn't think much at the time as she thought that he was just a playful boy, so he did it on purpose to make them allow him to go out to play. And she also gently told Yang that he had just arrived here for the first time. How come he had any friends? But Yang insisted, pointing to the yard and saying that some friends were standing outside calling him out to play with them for a while already. When Yang's father heard that, he became concerned. He assumed that because he was tired from the long journey, he had become ill or developed a fever. But no matter how he explained, no one could see the three spirits outside, waving to Yang. They were also children, about Yang's age, 2 boys and 1 girl, with very happy faces but pale skin, and they were constantly inviting him to go out and play with them. Yang was just a kid, so he didn't think much about ghosts or humans when he saw friends waving at him, so he raised his hand, smiled, and waved back. At this point, Yang's parents were very concerned, looked at the door in the direction Yang waved, but they couldn't see anyone. Yang's father was worried that his son would have developed a fever, so he instructed his wife to check his temperature. The wife checked hastily, thinking her son was ill, but after a while Yang's body was completely normal, with no fever or anything. Seeing this, Yang's father believed that his son was mischievous, so he asked Yang to go to bed early. He'd been traveling all day, so he obeyed his father and went to bed. Yang planned to go out tomorrow afternoon to play with her friends, so the entire family quickly cleaned up and went to bed early. Around midnight, there was a sound of children laughing and whispering outside the windows, as if they were calling someone. Yang's father was too tired today, so he didn't react. He couldn't hear the sound at all. Yang's mother, on the other hand, was more sensitive. The noise was minor, but it woke her up. The first thing Yang's mother noticed when she opened her eyes was that Yang had disappeared, and she had no idea where or when he had left the bed. Normally, when they traveled or went to strange places, Yang would also wake up his mother to take him to the toilet. She became concerned and got out of bed to go find Yang. As she passed by the window, she heard children's laughter that sounded very similar to Yang's, so Yang's mother went out to look out the window. Went to the window, looked out at the yard. She planned to open the glass windows to take a look around. However, before she could open the glass, the terrifying sight caused her to scream in terror. Yang was clearly visible at this point, sitting under a tree in the yard, playing with the ground and surrounded by 3 other children. Yang, on the other hand, sat on the ground, his hands constantly digging for something, and his expression was very strange. The mother was so terrified that she could only scream, which woke Yang's father up. The children outside in the yard heard Yang's mother's voice and turned to look at her through the window. Their eyes were white with no irises. Their mouths had a devilish smile, and Yang appeared to have missed his mother's voice. They immediately became enraged when they noticed Yang's mother standing at the window and spotted them. They didn't want others to bother Yang, and they seemed to have manipulated Yang into doing something. Yang looked like a lost soul right now. Yang's father also jumped out of bed to rush to his wife's aid. He still had no idea what was going on. Yang's mother was so terrified that she nearly fainted. After assisting his wife, he also looked out the window to see what was happening to her. Yang's father was a man who had served in the army. Seeing his son surrounded by ghostly children, he stormed the door and went out into the yard. The children slowly dispersed as Yang's father approached, and Yang was still digging in the ground with his hands. The 3 spirits did not forget to leave a ghostly smile before disappearing. Their shapes also became devilishly twisted and vanished. He went to the tree where Yang was sitting and called out for him, but he didn't respond. When he saw that, he hastily lifted Yang up. Yang's body had just seemed to melt, with no resistance at all. His hands remained clutching the dirt below until his father lifted him up. He refused to let go. Both his hands, feet, and his clothes were soiled. His face was white, his mouth was still wet with saliva. His eyes were open, but he appeared to be sleeping, like a sleepwalker. Yang's father shook him constantly, fearful that something would happen to his son, and kept telling him to wake up. Fortunately, Yang's expression began to change after a while, and his eyes were no longer wide open. Yang's fingernails were painful because he had been digging in the ground with his bare hands for a long time. Yang burst into tears after regaining consciousness. Yang's parents escorted him to his room, cleaned the dirt for him, and cleaned the wound to prevent infection. Yang's father then inquired as to what had occurred earlier and why Yang had gone out to the yard. Yang whimpered about everything, even though he was afraid his parents would scold him. He was awakened in the middle of the night by the children's laughter, so he looked outside to see what was going on. Outside the window at the time, Yang noticed 3 children waving to him, accompanied by happy laughter, calling Yang to come play with them. Yang realized they were 3 children whom he had seen while having dinner. Yang was too young. He had no doubts when he jumped out of bed to go out. Yang opened the door and looked around for them. After all, they were all children, so it was understandable that they wanted to play. Yang noticed a large tree in the yard with silhouettes of children in the distance at this point. He intended to open the door to take a look, but the children kept calling from a distance. So for some reason he ran towards them unintentionally. Yang, on the other hand, felt nothing out of the ordinary and simply inquired as to why they were staying out so late. They didn't mean to keep it a secret from him. They said they died a few years ago. That surprised Yang. They claimed that someone kidnapped, murdered, and buried them under this tree, and they wanted Yang to save them. Hearing this, Yang sat down unconsciously, began digging, and then couldn't remember anything. After all, Yang wasn't afraid, and he still wanted his parents to save the children. Yang's parents were perplexed by this. They exchanged glances but said nothing. It was difficult to believe, but everything that happened tonight made them concerned a lot. They put Yang to sleep, intended to solve the problem tomorrow. The next day, Yang's father asked his village neighbors to dig up the soil beneath the tree, and as Yang stated, they had only dug a little when a skeleton was discovered beneath the mud and soil. After digging was completed, 3 sets of small skeletons were discovered beneath the tree. They immediately reported it to the police and clarified everything. According to Yang, they caught the killers. They were the girl's uncle and aunt 2 years ago due to a lack of money. They lured the girl to invite 2 more friends over to play and then arrested all 3 children. Someone wanted to buy them for a high price, so they loaded the 3 children into the trunk and began transporting them. They pulled over in the middle of the road to rest and also opened the trunk to inspect the children's situation. The children couldn't stand the distance and the heat of the summer, so they suffocated and died. They didn't know what to do at the time, so they dug a hole in the ground and buried the children's bodies there. Yang's grandmother died a long time ago, and Yang's parents also rarely visited, so almost no one knew about this. But they would never know. Evil deeds would be discovered. The children had been waiting for Yang for a long time. They knew that they would be saved. The story happened at the hospital where my mother worked. I was very young that year. After school, I would often go to the hospital to wait for my mother to get off work and then go do all my homework. But that day, my mother left work later than usual until 7 o'clock in the evening, but still no sign of her. I also finished my homework a long time ago. Seeing that I was bored, my mother's colleagues gave me a tablet to watch cartoons. After a long time, I also saw my mother walking in with a colleague from outside, and everyone seemed to be giving someone first aid. My mother and her colleagues pushed the hospital bed very quickly with very serious expressions. But at that time, I was very young. I did not understand the patient's situation and my mother's work, so as soon as I saw my mother, I was very happy and ran out to call her. In return, my mother was very upset, so she asked me to sit at the table and wait for her and not to make a fuss. My mother's reaction scared me a bit. After that, my mother quickly pushed the patient away, leaving me alone in the hallway. I was a little sad, lonely, and about to cry because I was yelled at by my mother and also waiting for too long. But I also loved my mother, so I didn't want to make her sad. so I was depressed and decided to go back to the front desk to continue waiting. But just halfway through, suddenly a cold wind blew from somewhere, making my skin turn into goosebumps. It was almost summer, so there couldn't be such a cold wind. The wind was so cold that it made my body cringe, and I felt like the cold air got closer and closer to me, getting colder and colder. Suddenly a patient was walking past me, and I felt a chill emanating from him that made me look up. But I didn't know why or when I looked at this man, I felt so scared. This feeling made my body tremble. Then he also turned his head and looked at me. His face was wrinkled, the hair was white and the skin was very pale, looking very scary. He didn't do anything to me, but I was so scared that I cried. My mind went blank, but I was still afraid of what he would do to me. But then he turned around and continued towards the emergency room. The strange thing was that no one seemed to have seen him. As he passed me, the coldness gradually subsided. He also walked very fast, like just passing people in the hallway. Soon he was at the door of the emergency room where my mother had just entered. Looking at his back, I saw him just standing there and looking inside, his figure looking somber. At that time, I just thought it must be a patient's family member visiting his family member. Even though I kept looking at him, I still had a feeling of fear. But that's all I didn't want to care about anymore. I turned to go back to the front desk, intending to continue waiting for my mother to finish her work. But curiosity kept me watching to see what he would do. After looking into the emergency room, I saw him sitting in the waiting chair in front of the room. Suddenly he turned around and looked straight at me. As soon as he saw that I was also watching him, he immediately reached out to me and waved as if I wanted to go there. I didn't understand why, but I was scared at that time. But I still obeyed and walked over to the older man. I felt like he was trying to tell me something important. When I got there, he started asking me strange things. He was surprised when I saw him. At that time, I didn't understand what he meant. As soon as I heard that I could see him, his expression became more terrifying, but he seemed very happy. He wanted to ask me to do a favor for him before he passed away. At that time, I was a little surprised when an older man asked me to help with something, and he also said some very strange things. Without waiting for my consent, he asked me to meet his son and said that there was a passbook under the drawer in his room. He couldn't speak now. He could only count on me. Hearing this, I still wondered why he didn't say it by himself, and where was he going to go after all? Before I could reframe what he had just asked, the door to the emergency room opened. Mother and her colleagues also came out from the inside, accompanied by disappointed expressions. Seeing me, my mother was also very surprised. Quickly asked me what I was doing here, why not wait for her at the front desk? Walking around was easy to get lost. I quickly explained about the older man talking to me. So while crying, I sobbed, pointed to the waiting chair, saying that the older man was sitting there. But when I looked back, the older man was no longer there. I was also extremely surprised and confused because now it looked like I was lying. I looked everywhere to look for the older man, but he was nowhere to be found. At this time, my mother started to get annoyed and frustrated because she thought that the work was stressful and I still came to disturb her, so she quickly took my hand and pushed me away. I cried as I tried to explain to my mother and everyone about the older man. I also did not forget to describe to my mother the appearance of that older man, hoping everyone would believe what I said. But hearing this, everyone was surprised and a little panicked, because the person I just described was exactly like the older man who died in the emergency room that my mother and colleagues had just tried to save. Hearing this, my mother and everyone suddenly became silent because of panic, but I neither understood nor realized. I just thought that they didn't believe me, so I still tried to explain. My mother saw this and quickly pulled me out, so I had to leave without being able to help the older man with anything. I also didn't pay attention to the older man's request and followed my mother to leave. That night, after having dinner, I quickly went to bed because the following day was the first day of the week I had to go to school. After falling asleep for a while, I suddenly felt someone standing next to my bed. The cold air began to spread throughout the room. That made me wake up. I started to open my eyes. In my reverie, I saw a dark figure approaching in front of me. Immediately after that, I had to open my eyes wide and got up. In front of my eyes was the older man's face at night. His eyes widened and his tone was extremely angry. He whispered in my ear about my failure to help him deliver the word. I panicked and screamed at that moment. Looking back now, I feel lucky that the older man didn't do me any harm. My parents in the next room also heard the screams and ran to my room in a panic. The light was turned on and the older man also disappeared. Seeing my parents, I quickly hugged and sobbed. I told them about the older man who came to find me because I didn't help him. Only now did my mother listen and ask me to explain everything. Before, although I wanted to clarify, she still thought that I was too young for her to listen to me. I started talking about the cold wind in the hallway and how I met the strange older man. Then, what the older man asked me to tell his son. I also talked about seeing the older man standing next to the bed with an angry expression. The very following morning, my father was off work and took me to the hospital. My mother also found information about the older man and met his son. I told the son everything. He was also very surprised and emotional. Just the next day, the son came to see my family and he bowed his head to thank us for actually having a passbook in the drawer that his father had left behind. If it weren't for me, the older man wouldn't have been able to get away with peace of mind.